She was the girl in the most famous photograph of the 1980s, but the camera never caught the whole story. Born into European royalty of cinema, Nastassja Kinski was molded into an icon before she could consent to the role. The image promised freedom. The life demanded surrender. What nobody knew was the price that came with being the most desired woman in the world, and how that desire would haunt her long after the spotlight faded. The Kinsky name carried weight in post-war Europe like few others. Klaus Kinski, her father, was a brilliant and volatile German actor whose intensity could fill a theater and terrify a household in equal measure. His performances were legendary, raw, unhinged, transcendent. He had worked with the greatest directors of the century, Werner Herzog, who filmed him crawling through the jungle in Aguirre, The Wrath of God; Francis Ford Coppola, who cast him as Renfield in Dracula's Curse. Klaus lived art with a kind of religious fervor. He demanded that everyone around him live that way too. Her mother, Nastassja Viparev, was a Russian actress and painter, beautiful, cultured, deeply sensitive, but ultimately caught in the tempest of Klaus's unpredictability. She had her own artistic vision, but it was often overshadowed by the force of her husband's presence. Nastassja Aglaya was born in Berlin in 1961, the eldest daughter, arriving into a world of artistic extremes and emotional chaos that would define her entire life. Her childhood was a collision between privilege and precariousness. The family moved constantly: Berlin, Paris, California, following Klaus's work and his mercurial moods. Home was never quite stable. Klaus demanded excellence from everyone, especially his children. But excellence wasn't enough. It had to be genius-level work, performed with absolute commitment and emotional vulnerability. He taught his children to act before they learned to read, to understand emotion before they understood grammar. Nastassja watched her father transform himself into different characters, different people, different versions of consciousness. She learned that identity was malleable, that the self was something you could perform, that authenticity was actually a craft to be mastered. She also learned that being beautiful in this household meant being visible, and being visible meant being scrutinized. Her father noticed everything about her appearance, her movement, her emotional expressions. He praised her potential. He also, sometimes without meaning to, made her feel like an object to be perfected rather than a person to be loved. By adolescence, Nastassja understood that her beauty was her destiny. Klaus began mentoring her toward acting almost before she could fully articulate that she might want something else. At 14, she studied at the prestigious Lee Strasberg Theater Institute in New York, absorbing the Stanislavski method while other girls her age were figuring out who they were, what they liked, what their futures might hold. Nastassja didn't have that luxury. The trajectory was already written in her bones, in her face, in the weight of the Kinsky name. She was meant to be an actress. She was meant to be extraordinary. She was meant to carry the family legacy forward and perhaps even surpass it. At 16, she landed her first film role in a small European production. Nobody paid attention, but her father did. He saw the spark, the potential, the raw material for greatness. By 18, she was in Roman Polanski's Tess, a reimagining of Thomas Hardy's novel that required her to convey innocence, vulnerability, confusion, and the slow destruction that comes from being desired by men who don't truly see you. The role would define her career. It would also trap her in a particular kind of image from which she would spend decades trying to escape. The late 1970s and early 1980s were when Nastassja's face became synonymous with a particular brand of European cinema: art house elegance, intellectual sensuality, the muse of auteurs who saw her as a blank canvas for their artistic vision. She worked with some of the greatest directors alive: Roman Polanski again, in Frantic; Francis Ford Coppola, who cast her in One from the Heart; Terrence Malick, whose The Thin Red Line would later feature her in haunting sequences. Each film added another layer to the myth: the girl who was untouchable, unreachable, a work of art herself, a living sculpture created for the camera's gaze. What the industry saw was a blank canvas. What her agents and managers saw was bankability. What the public saw was desire made flesh. What Nastassja experienced was the weight of constant interpretation, the exhaustion of never being asked what she wanted, the creeping sense that her body and face belonged to everyone but her. She wasn't a person being photographed. She was a symbol being constructed, a myth being written, a fantasy being actualized. And the construction was suffocating in ways that nobody around her seemed to understand or acknowledge. In 1981, photographer Richard Avedon, one of the greatest portrait artists of the 20th century, created an image that would become the most iconic photograph of a generation. Avedon had photographed everyone, presidents and peasants, celebrities and unknowns. He had a gift for capturing not just how people looked, but who they were at their essence. The series he shot of Nastassja included a nude shot that was electric, vulnerable yet commanding, sensual yet philosophical, innocent yet knowing. The image circulated through magazines and galleries. It was celebrated by art critics as a masterpiece of portraiture. It was dissected and discussed and debated. It became Nastassja's defining visual signature, the image that preceded her name in every conversation. But here's what the photograph didn't show, what nobody ever discussed: how little control she had over its creation, its distribution, its meaning. She was a subject in that session, yes, but she was also an object being positioned, lit, directed. The image belonged to the world now. She was the girl in the Avedon photograph. That became her primary identity, and she had to watch as her body became something everyone owned, but no one truly saw. Something that became more real than her actual self. The contradiction was psychologically crushing. On screen and in magazines, she was desire incarnate. The fantasy made real, the unattainable made visible. Off-screen, she was increasingly isolated. The more beautiful and famous she became, the more alone she felt. How do you have relationships when everyone who approaches you sees the myth first and the person never? How do you form genuine connections when the professional machinery surrounding your image treats intimacy as a threat to the brand? How do you trust anyone's affection when you can never be sure whether they're drawn to you or to the icon you've been forced to become? She became involved with Quincy Jones, the legendary music producer, composer, and cultural polymath who had worked with everyone from Duke Ellington to Michael Jackson. In Jones, Nastassja found a mind that could engage with hers on multiple levels, someone who understood the machinery of the entertainment industry from the inside, who had navigated his own relationship with fame and creative control. Their relationship reportedly brought her a kind of peace, a sense of being understood by someone who wasn't starstruck, who could see past the image to the person beneath. But even that relationship existed in the glare of public speculation, not as a love story to be celebrated, but as a scandal to be dissected, a tabloid puzzle to be solved. The age difference became a point of fascination and judgment. The affair became a narrative. The two of them, as people trying to connect, became characters in someone else's story. The mid-1980s brought a crisis that the industry never fully acknowledged, that Nastassja herself kept largely private for decades. She experienced a severe mental health breakdown, the culmination of years of pressure, objectification, family legacy she couldn't escape, and the professional machinery that treated her as a beautiful thing to be deployed rather than a person to be supported. The stress of maintaining an image, of being constantly photographed, of having every choice interpreted through the lens of her beauty and her desirability, had accumulated into something unbearable. She couldn't eat without wondering if it would affect how she looked on camera. She couldn't age without feeling like she was betraying the industry's expectations. She couldn't be tired or sad or angry or ordinary. The constant performance was destroying her. She withdrew from public life for a period. She sought professional treatment. She tried to reclaim some privacy in an industry built on the opposite principle, In a world that had been taught to see her body as public property, few people knew the depth of her struggle. The films kept coming, though more selectively. The image remained intact, though she was behind the scenes, barely holding herself together. But behind the poster, behind the photographs, behind the carefully curated public appearances, Nastassja was fighting for her sanity, learning how to breathe, trying to figure out who she was beneath the myth that had been constructed around her. What followed was an attempt at reinvention that, tragically, the industry wouldn't quite allow. She pivoted toward television, appeared in ambitious independent projects, tried to expand her range beyond the ingenue roles that had defined and confined her. She sought out directors who saw her as more than an icon, who wanted to explore her capacity for complex characters and emotional depth. But the machinery had already decided who she was and what she represented. She was the girl from Avedon's photograph. She was the face of 1980s European art cinema. She was the daughter of Klaus Kinski, inheritor of both his extraordinary talent and his tormented demons. To ask her to be anything else felt wrong to a public that had already constructed her identity in stone. She was held hostage by the very beauty that had promised to set her free, trapped by the very success that was supposed to empower her. The relationship with her father remained a complicated and often painful anchor throughout her life. Klaus was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure, a man of genuine genius and genuine demons. He loved his daughter fiercely. He also used her, knowingly or not, as an extension of his own legacy, as a way of proving that his artistic vision could be passed down and perfected in the next generation. When Nastassja succeeded professionally, Klaus claimed partial credit, as though her achievements were proof of his parenting. When she struggled, he offered intensity rather than solace, artistic challenge rather than emotional support. He would push her to go deeper, to feel more, to suffer more in service of the art. The therapy she needed was art itself. The love she needed was expressed through criticism and demand. Nastassja spent decades trying to distinguish between her own voice and his influence, between what she actually wanted from her life and what the Kinsky name demanded from her. She had to figure out whether her love of acting came from genuine passion or from lifelong conditioning. She had to learn to hear her own desires beneath the echo of her father's voice. That she managed to maintain any sense of self through this was remarkable. That the effort cost her so much, in relationships, in years of struggle, in untold hours of therapy, was tragic. By the 1990s, Nastassja had begun to step back from the spotlight with intention and purpose. She appeared selectively, chose her projects carefully, and reclaimed some agency over her image and her time. She moved away from the epicenter of the industry's gaze, away from the parties and the premieres, and the constant red carpet performance. She became a mother, an experience that reportedly shifted her entire understanding of identity and purpose in ways that cinema never could. Motherhood gave her a role that couldn't be photographed or commodified, a relationship that couldn't be analyzed by critics or interpreted by strangers. She formed relationships on her own terms, away from cameras and speculation, relationships that were allowed to be private and imperfect. She even pursued painting like her mother before her, a quiet creative act that belonged to her alone, that didn't require public validation or industry approval. These weren't dramatic choices that made headlines. They were survival strategies, and they worked. The late career recognition, when it came in the 2010s, felt different from the earlier acclaim that had felt so suffocating. In 2017, Nastassja received a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Berlin Film Festival, the city where she was born, the place where her story had begun decades earlier. She was honored not just as an icon or a sex symbol, but as an artist who had endured, who had survived the machinery of fame, who had chosen depth over commodity, privacy over performance. The speech she gave was measured and reflective, the words of someone who had not won but survived. She spoke about the cost of beauty in an industry obsessed with surfaces, about the gap between image and identity, about the long and difficult journey toward reclaiming one's own story. She spoke quietly, without bitterness, without resentment, which somehow made the words more devastating. She described the loneliness of being desired by millions while feeling unseen by everyone. She talked about the privilege of her life. She knew this, but also the price. She thanked the people who had seen her as a person, rather than a symbol, and she expressed gratitude for the years she had spent away from the spotlight, learning who she actually was beneath the myth. What Nastassja Kinski's life teaches us is this: that the most beautiful things often carry the most hidden wounds. That being desired by millions is not the same as being seen by anyone. That the machinery of fame operates on the assumption that its subjects exist to be consumed, not protected, not heard, not honored as full human beings. She was born into a dynasty of performance, groomed for stardom from childhood, and then held responsible for maintaining an image she never fully consented to create. She paid a price in privacy, in autonomy, in the simple right to be imperfect and ordinary and unexceptional. But she also endured. She thought for herself when thinking for herself was the hardest thing to do. She stepped away when she needed to, even though stepping away meant losing relevance and power in an industry that measures worth in visibility. And in doing so, she proved that the real act of rebellion for someone constructed as an icon is not to perform forever, not to maintain the image, not to keep feeding the machinery. It's to choose obscurity, family, and truth. It's to reclaim the right to be unknown. Today, Nastassja Kinski is less visible, but more real than she has ever been. She has adult children. She paints. She lives a life that is largely private by choice. She gives occasional interviews that reveal someone far more thoughtful, complex, and genuinely interesting than any single photograph could ever capture. She is no longer the girl in the Avedon image, and that, finally, after decades, is a form of freedom. She is not defined by her beauty, though she remains beautiful. She is not consumed by her legacy, though she honors it. She is simply Nastassja, a woman who survived, who learned, who grew. Her story is a reminder that behind every perfect image, there is a person paying a price we can't see. The next time you see that iconic photograph, the one that changed cinema, the one that defined an era, remember this: the woman in it was never just the image. She was always something more. And she spent decades becoming brave enough to claim it, to speak it, to live it. She chose her own story, finally. And that choice was the greatest act of her life. If stories about the hidden costs of beauty, fame, and identity speak to you, if you want to understand the real price paid by those who become icons, subscribe to explore more untold narratives of those who survived the machinery of celebrity and chose themselves.